All right, well, I think we can get started and have people join us as they log on.
Sure, that
So,
sounds good.
yeah, so I'm going to start by welcoming everyone to Booked for Lunch. I think most of you know me, Kim Mellon, co-director of the Wilton Historical Society. Joining us today is Karen Abbott, who prefers to be addressed as Abbott, author of The Ghosts of Eden Park, The Bootleg King, The Women Who Pursued Him, and The Murder That Shocked Jazz Age America. This is not the first Karen Abbott book we have read in this book group. Some of you may remember in 2015, we read one of her earlier books, Liar, Soldier, Temptress, Spy.
It's Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy. I know, everybody gets like mixed up.
What did I say? Liar, Soldier,
Liar, Soldier. Yeah, it's Liar, Temptress.
Yeah. Liar, Soldier, Temptress, Spy, 4 Women Undercover in the Civil War. That book brought to life 4 different and courageous women who risked their lives for the side they believed in. If you haven't already read that one, I suggest you read that. I really highly recommend it. When we discussed that book, we met by ourselves, but today we have the benefit of being joined by the author herself, who will tell us how she was inspired to write about George Remus's sensational story. In addition to today's book and the previous one that we read, Liar, Abbott has written other books, including Sin in the Second City and American Rose. She has also written for The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian Magazine, and other publications. The Ghosts of Eden Park became an instant New York Times bestseller and an Edgar Award finalist for Best Fact Crime. She also won other accolades and awards for this book. The Wall Street Journal named her one of the masters of the art of narrative fiction, nonfiction. After reading 2 of her books, The Ghosts of Eden Park and Liar, Soldier, Temptress, Spy, I couldn't agree more that her nonfiction books read more like suspense novels. A few notes on the program. Please keep your audio on mute during the program, and then we will have a Q&A at the end, which I will monitor. I encourage you to submit questions via chat, and depending on our time frame and whatnot, maybe we can have you pose your questions yourself, but sometimes working with the chat works the best. So now, please join me in welcoming Abbott to our Booked for Lunch group.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kim, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the Connecticut Historical Society for having me, and thanks to all of you for joining in today and for reading the book. I had a lot of fun writing this book. I hope you all had fun reading it, and really eager to talk about it with you today. And I usually start by talking about how I get my ideas, and I usually get my ideas from going to libraries, sipping through old books, going to archives. But I happened to get the idea for The Ghosts of Eden Park by watching television. Specifically, I watched a show called Boardwalk Empire, which ran on HBO for about 5 seasons in the 2000s. If you are looking for a binge show to watch, I highly recommend it. It's a really great TV show. And it starred one of the characters was named George Remus. He was a minor character. He was mostly used for comic relief, but I found him so innovative and so cuckoo and so fascinating. He stole every scene he was in. Here is a still of from Boardwalk Empire. The great actor Glenn Fleshler played George Remus. He actually really scarily resembles him. And George Remus spoke of himself in the third person on the show, as you could see in the slide. Just to give you some context, he's speaking with Steve Buscemi's character, a gangster in Atlantic City named Nucky Thompson. And Remus is on the phone with him, and they're wheeling and dealing. And Remus says in the third person, "Remus finds you petty and resentful." And all of the gangsters always got confused about Remus speaking in the third person, but it was one of his defining characteristics. And he sort of was a really interesting character. And I wondered if he was based on a real historic figure. I knew that many other of the characters in the show were based on real people. And sure enough, I discovered that George Remus was actually a real character in American history. And the real George Remus also spoke of himself in the third person, I would soon learn. He said things like, it's going to be a hell of a Christmas for Remus. So many people want to kill Remus. And my personal favorite, it was when he said, Remus's brain exploded. You have to read the book to know if a brain explosion actually occurred, if it was literal or figurative, but a brain explosion it was one of his sayings. And I discovered that the real George Remus had a life that I think was much more dramatic than anything that was portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. And I decided he would make a really fantastic subject for a book. So I'm really excited to speak to you about him. Before I get into the character of George Remus, I just want to take a second to talk about researching George Remus. I'm sure there's some research buffs in the audience there. I discovered that there was a trial transcript at Yale University Law Library in New Haven, Connecticut. As soon as I found this out, I hightailed it up to Yale University and spent a week, from morning till evening until the library opened until it closed, Xeroxing every single page of a 5,500 page manuscript. This is just one volume of the many, many volumes I decided to copy. And this will probably sound weird, but I have to say that this overhead scanner was one of the most beautiful pieces of equipment I have ever seen in my life. I was so used to scanners being the kind where you have to flip the book over and you have to align the pages, and it's a headache and it gives you a hernia and it's not fun and it ruins the text. But this was it was just a blissful week of research. And I was also very lucky that this manuscript survived. It's very, very rare for anything from the 1920s to survive, especially a trial transcript. They get lost, they get destroyed. Sometimes they're just never, put into storage at all. And it was really fortunate that I had this. Some of my favorite details that I include in the book came from this trial transcript. One of them is the fact that George Remus did not wear underwear, which apparently in the 1920s was cause for great alarm. Not wearing underwear, was possibly the sign of having an unsound mind. It was a very scandalous thing. It took me about 4 months, all told, to go through this entire transcript and take notes. And the resulting outline was about 85,000 words, which was nearly the length of the book itself. So it was really kind of a very, very juicy bit of research that I did, and it was really great fun. And the other fantastic thing about this trial transcript was that it let me write a nonfiction book as a whodunit. It's very, very rare that nonfiction writers who have to stick to the historical record. You can't make up dialogue, you can't make up events. To actually craft a story that reads like a mystery whodunit. Somebody gets shot in the beginning, it's like Chekhov's gun, and then you find out later on, but the characters, it could go either way. He could get shot, she could get shot, anyone could die. And it was really great to be able to craft a nonfiction story using those elements of fiction. So here's George Remus. How do you solve a problem like George Remus? His life was so dramatic and interesting. I think he came over from Germany when he was a small child. His family settled in Chicago. His father, in Remus's own words, was a mean and abusive alcoholic. Remus had to quit school at a young age to support his family because his father could no longer work. He went to work at an uncle's pharmacy. He really was well skilled at that job. He decided to study law during the evenings. He put himself through law school. He was really quite ambitious and a very intelligent person. And he became a well-known defense lawyer in Chicago. And he was particularly known for his dramatic courtroom antics. He would run across the courtroom and cry and scream and tear out his hair and attack opposing counsel. And all of his many detractors called him the weeping, crying Remus. But he was very good at what he did. And in 1919, he started noticing that a new type of client was coming to his office. And these were men who were charged with violating prohibition laws. And Remus was amazed at the ease with which they paid their fines. They would just come in, slap a bunch of money down on his desk, and they would be back on their merry way. Remus knew he was much smarter than any of these men and decided that he himself could become a bootlegger and be much more successful at it than any of the men he was representing. So he took his pharmaceutical background and his legal background, and he studied the Volstead Act. And he decided he was going to find a loophole, and he did. And that loophole was that with a physician's prescription, it was legal to manufacture, sell, and distribute alcohol for quote unquote medicinal purposes. Now that was quite a loophole. Very few people were actually using manufacturing and distributing alcohol for medicinal purposes. But Remus decided that that was a loophole he was going to exploit. And he decided to, start putting a plan into motion. This is Imogene Holmes. She became a major part of his plan. I love this picture of Imogene. It's just, if we could just take a moment to admire that ridiculous and fantastic hat. And the way that her finger is positioned just so to show the enormous honking diamond ring on her finger. But anyway, Imogene Holmes started out as a very poor woman in Remus's Chicago law office. She was the cleaning person. They called them dust girls at that time. And she was going through a really terrible divorce, and Remus was also having marital problems, and they decided to commiserate about their mutually miserable marriages. I love Remus's wife. His first wife had actually filed for divorce, and one of the things that she cited in her divorce filing was his habit to come home early in the morning. And I just love these old tidbits from vintage divorce files, just things you would never see in a divorce file today. But they decided to leave their respective spouses. They fell in love. They were going to plan their own life together and get married. And Remus really saw something in Imogene. He thought that she had a very street smart about her. She was savvy. He respected her decisions and her opinions with regard to business. He thought she had a good instinct. So he had many nicknames for her, but one of his early nicknames for her was Prime Minister, which shows you, kind of gives you an idea of how he viewed her. Now, Imogene, meanwhile, only had one nickname for George Remus, and that was Daddy, which I think also says something about the relationship. But they decided to move to Cincinnati together. They left Chicago, moved to Cincinnati, and it was a very strategic location because 80% of the country's pre-prohibition bonded whiskey was stored in warehouses that were located within 300 miles of Cincinnati. So it's a very centralized strategic location. Also, of course, good transportation hub to get to New York, Chicago, and other major cities. And so they moved over there in about 1919, beginning of 1920. And here's the fantastic house that they bought in Cincinnati. This was the Price Hill neighborhood, which at the time was a very prestigious, expensive neighborhood in Cincinnati. They planned extensive renovations on this house. They were going to make it their own. And as a gift to his new bride, Remus put the deed to this home in Imogene's name. And it was one of many decisions he would come to regret. This is George Connors. If you read the book, he's featured quite prominently. He was Remus's right-hand man, sort of his business partner, his advisor, his consigliere. He was very well suited for this role because while Remus was sort of volatile and flew off the handle, George Connors was very calm, cool, and collected. He also had really good contacts in Cincinnati real estate and sort of knew how to get Remus the lay of the land. And he helped Remus plan his big prohibition empire. This empire had 4 different components to it. That the operation would have 4 different components to it, and I'll explain them briefly just so you get an idea of how brilliant Remus really was. So the plan was to first acquire whiskey certificates to acquire wholesale drug companies, which ties in the whole medicinal market thing. Acquire whiskey certificates, but would enable him to get the whiskey out of those warehouses. Then he would, this was all legal, by the way, he would take all of that whiskey, allegedly headed to the medicinal market, and start planning the routes for that and all the customers for that and line everybody up. Then, and the real genius of his plan was that he formed his own transportation company. So this transportation company would have a separate fleet of trucks, and this separate fleet of trucks would hijack the initial fleet of trucks, steal all of that liquor that had been headed toward the medicinal market, ostensibly, and divert that whiskey to the illegal market at any price that Remus named. So he was really robbing Remus to pay Remus. And he called this ingenious enterprise the Circle, kind of makes sense. And within 1 year of starting operations on the Circle, George Remus owned 35% of all of the alcohol in the United States, which to me was just a staggering figure. And he earned between $20 million and $40 million. And that is not a figure that's adjusted for inflation. That is actually in 1921 money, which is just almost unfathomable. And I think the greatest irony of all of this is that George Remus, who was making $40 million in 1921 on alcohol, was a teetotaler who never had a drop to drink in his life. So this is Death Valley. This is George Remus's center of operations. It was located just outside of Cincinnati. George Connors found him this spot, and he found it for Remus after Remus had been a victim of whiskey pirates. Now, whiskey pirates were not, the ahoy matey pirate variety. They were actually these roving bands of thieves who would descend upon a warehouse, steal all the alcohol inside, and bring it, take it for themselves, and basically robbing the big bootleggers. Remus had been victimized a couple times by the whiskey pirates and decided he was going to take a stand against that. So he set up this place. It's called Death Valley. And it was named Death Valley in honor of whiskey pirates who tried to trespass and were never heard from again. And he really built this thing up like a fortress. There were lookout spots where men were situated with rifles and guns. There were floodlights that would go on at certain times. There was even you had to know the code of how to blink your headlights on your car in order to gain entry. It was sort of like a Morse code situation where you really had to know how to get in there. And it was really successful at keeping whiskey pirates out. It was less successful at thwarting the federal agents who would eventually come for Remus, but that's a story for later on. So I was really pleased to find this speakeasy menu during my research. This is an actual speakeasy menu that was from a Chicago speakeasy around 1924. And you can see some of the great cocktail names up here. There's the Dirty Dick Special, the Prince of Wales, the Maiden's Prayer. One of my absolute favorites was the Corpse Reviver, which, as you might surmise from the name of the drink, was a hangover cure, the Corpse Reviver. So just kind of fascinating that this survived, and just gives you an insight into what people are drinking and how much these drinks cost. A champagne cocktail, for example, was only 75 cents, which I don't think we'll see that price again. But really, really fun to stumble upon this during my research. Here's George Remus with his mother. He was quite a mama's boy, and I sort of liked playing with their relationship in the book, and because George Remus's mother and Imogene Remus did not at all get along. George Remus was very supportive of his mother and always gave her money. And of course, Imogene wanted all of the money for herself. But my favorite story about George Remus and his mother has to do with the death of George Remus's father. As the story goes, Mrs. Remus and her husband were once out one night in a Chicago saloon not far from their home. They got into an argument, and Remus's mother smashed his father over the head with a glass bottle. He died shortly thereafter from the wound. Now, Remus, wanting to protect his mother and to keep her from speaking indiscriminately to the coroner, locked her in an attic for 3 days until the inquest was over, so she couldn't incriminate herself. And to me, this just says a lot about who George Remus was and the lengths to which he would go in order to make things go his way. If he had an idea of how things should turn out, he would stoop to, nothing was too outrageous, even locking your mother away for 3 days. So by 1921, the renovations on George Remus's house were complete. Excuse me, they totaled about $750,000, which is the equivalent of about $12 million today. So quite a lot of money spent on renovations. I think it's safe to say that George Remus was not a minimalist. If you take a look at this room, it's sort of, let's throw as many cherubs and plants in the room as we can. My favorite piece in this room is the piano. You can't tell from this photograph, but it was actually a gold piano. And it is this is my second nonfiction book that actually features a gold piano. The first one was in Sin in the Second City, which is the story of a Chicago brothel that operated in the early 1900s. And I like to think that the piano from the Everly Club, the brothel in Chicago, somehow ended up in George Remus's mansion 20 years later. I have no proof of that, but it's something I like to think. But anyway, this mansion was very important to George and Imogene. The renovations and the sort of style was meant to announce to the world that they have arrived. They really were interested in ingratiating themselves with society folks, with blue bloods, with old money, not only in Cincinnati, but across the country. And And it was very important for them that their house reflected those ambitions. Here's another room in their home, much more tastefully done, in my opinion, just a really beautiful solarium. I love some of the antique furnishings, especially the fringed lamp over here and the that really cool globe looking sort of light on the table there. In order to really announce their arrival to society, George and Imogene planned a very expensive and extensive New Year's Eve party in 1921. They sent out invitations all across the country to, you know, industrialists, capitalists, judges, politicians, sports figures, anyone who was anyone got an invitation to George Remus's party. These are the actual invitations that were sent out. I was staggered to find out that one of them survived. This was found in a historical society just outside of Cincinnati. If you can't read the text, it says, "Our New Year's greeting, dive to health, swim to health, wealth, float on happiness, 1921, 1922. Considering the level of debauchery they had planned at this party, I don't quite understand the mom and the baby down in the lower hand corner. It's kind of a bizarre illustration. But Imogene designed these invitations, and of course, whatever Imogene wanted, Imogene got. Here is Imogene getting ready for her party, the party in the new boudoir, which is just a fantastic, again, let's just take a moment to celebrate her amazing Art Deco gown, which is just gorgeous, and some of the decor in the room. And I think this picture says a lot about Imogene. She wanted that reflection in the mirror to be just right. I kind of feel sorry for whatever photographer had to probably spend hours getting that perfect shot for Imogene. But it was a very important shot for her, a very important evening for her. She was finally Mrs. George Remus, and she was somebody, and she was going to really establish her position in society. So this is a cartoon, and I love that newspapers used to do this. I wish they still did this. That illustrates exactly what went on in this party. There was a $100,000 swimming pool that Remus christened the Imogene Bass in honor of his wife. There were synchronized swimmers doing these elaborate routines. There were guests standing on the diving board giving toasts. Of course, here is Imogene Remus doing a daring dive in her risque one piece, which was quite scandalous. There was even something called needle baths in George Remus's pool area, including electric baths, which I had never heard of these things, and I looked them up. They were apparently an early version of a tanning bed. They were heated by incandescent lights and said to make the user frisky. To me, they just sounded like a good way to get electrocuted, but apparently the electric baths were very popular during this time period. If you were as wealthy as George Remus, which of course nobody was. This party became notorious afterward for the elaborate party favors that Remus handed out to all of his guests. Every man got a diamond stick pin and an engraved watch. Every single woman got a brand new 1922 car. Of course, this is well before, you know, Oprah Winfrey, you get a car and you get a car. Every single person there had a $1,000 bill tucked underneath their dinner plate, which is the equivalent of you and I looking under our seat right now and finding $14,000. So just ridiculous. He also lit his guest cigars with $100 bills. And just to put it all into perspective of how extravagant this was, the average annual salary at this time period was only $1,200. So just really a disgusting display of wealth. And here's an actual picture of the engraved watches that George Remus gave out at this party. I love that this survived as well. Really quite amazing. You see George Remus's insignia and Mr. and Mrs. George Remus, 1921. And this famous party was actually one of the reasons that that gave rise to the idea that F. Scott Fitzgerald based Jay Gatsby on George Remus. Now, there are all of these apocryphal stories that F. Scott Fitzgerald and George Remus met when Fitzgerald was stationed in Louisville, Kentucky during his military service. There's no hard evidence that they met, but it's definitely true that without a doubt, F. Scott Fitzgerald knew who George Remus was during this time period. Everybody knew who George Remus was by that time. And I think that the parallels between Jay Gatsby and George Remus are conspicuous. You know, both men owned a string of pharmacies. Both men were in love with a mysterious woman. Both men had these elaborate mansions and these extravagant parties. And as Fitzgerald writes, Jay Gatsby sprang from a platonic conception of himself. And he always had wanted to inhabit a world that didn't quite welcome him, you know, a world where he didn't really quite belong. And I think that that's also true in George Remus's circumstance. Both men had a sort of sense of melancholy running throughout their lives. It's not belonging. So this is Mabel Walker Willenbrandt. I always have to have a strong female character in my books. And this is Mabel Walker Willenbrandt. She was a really delight to write about. She was also on Boardwalk Empire. They called her Esther Randolph in the series. When she was appointed to be the Assistant Attorney General of the United States in 1921, women in this country had only had the right to vote for 9 months. She was only 5 years out of law school. She had never prosecuted a single case in her career. And she was suddenly in charge of prosecuting prohibition cases all around the country, including cases against George Remus. You can imagine the absurd amount of sexism that she faced as a female politician in a high position of power in 1921. And to add to her extensive challenges in this role, she was almost entirely deaf. And she spent every morning, about an hour every morning, arranging her hair to cover her hearing aids so that people would not be aware of this handicap. And it's just astounding that she was able to accomplish what she was able to accomplish. And it's, I think that she got hired by President Warren Harding and by her boss, Attorney General Harry Doherty, because they figured, here's a woman with no experience. Let's let the little lady do this job. She's going to be overwhelmed. She's not going to know what she's doing. And we're going to be able to continue our cozy relationship with the bootleggers and it's quid pro quo that we have established with many figures in prohibition. It should be said that the Warren Harding administration was notoriously corrupt. Everybody drank. Nobody was interested in enforcing prohibition, except for Mabel Walker Willenbrandt. She defies all of their low expectations, gets into her office, and just immediately starts kicking butt. And she starts going after George Remus. He becomes her sort of public enemy number one. She is going to build her career based on her case against George Remus. Now, this is Jess Smith. He is one of the corrupt officials in the Harding administration, and he occupied an office not far from Willenbrandt in the Department of Justice. Now, Willenbrandt really had no idea what Jess Smith was doing. To her, he just seemed, he had this nebulous sort of role. He was just a glorified servant for Attorney General Harry Doherty. But George Remus knew exactly who Jess Smith was because Jess Smith was Remus's liaison to the federal government. Jess Smith is the guy who provided George Remus with all of the government whiskey certificates that Remus needed to get that whiskey out of the warehouses. He also promised George Remus protection. George Remus would not be arrested. If he was arrested, he would not go to trial. If he went to trial, he would not be convicted. If he were convicted, he would get out of prison. There were all these levels of promises made. George Remus paid very handsomely for all these promises, in excess of $1 million. And he called Jess Smith his ace in the hole. And he figured that as long as he kept Jess Smith on his payroll, Remus's operation would be able to keep running smoothly and all would be well. Well, that is not exactly how things worked out. So I like this cartoon. It sort of depicts the challenges that Willenbrandt faced in trying to enforce prohibition in this country. Gives the little girl a hand. She only has a mop against this literal ocean of alcohol. And part of her issue was the United States itself. We have two long, craggy borders, 18,000 miles, of incredibly porous coastline. There was alcohol coming in from Mexico. It was hidden in trucks underneath bales of hay and distributed across the country. There was alcohol coming in from Canada. It would land on the Michigan Peninsula, aided and guided by searchlights. It was very organized. And on an individual level, Americans were incredibly innovative with how to bring their alcohol around with them. If Americans wanted to find a way to smuggle alcohol, they were going to do it. And I just want to talk about some of my favorite methods. There was a double amputee who boasted he could hide 36 pints of alcohol in his prosthetics. There was a raid on a soda parlor in Montana in which federal agents went into the back room and found it full of children's squirt guns, just water guns that were filled with alcohol. And they each had a 2-drink capacity. Then there was this. At first glance, this woman is just holding a leather-bound book. It's called The Four Swallows, and it was written by a man named J.B. Corn, a not very subtle reference to John Barleycorn. But if you flip off the top, you see that it's actually holding 4 glass vials. vials that could hold whiskey of your choice, hence the 4 swallows. This became a very popular flask during Prohibition. It was the work of a Brooklyn-based inventor named John Nuttree. Before Prohibition, he manufactured little personal coin banks that were made to look like books. But after the dawn of Prohibition, he saw an opportunity and started manufacturing these, patenting this invention in February of 1921. Became a very popular flask. Once in a while, if anybody's into those old antique auction sites, if you go on places like Worth Point, you'll find one of these for about $1,000, a real authentic one from 1921. So what is this woman doing? She looks like she's just enjoying her coffee in a cafe, but lo and behold, she's actually dumping a bunch of alcohol in her coffee with her cane. This was another popular flask during Prohibition. It was a cane that has a spin feature, like a screw feature, where if you unscrew it, there is a glass vial inside. You can fill it with alcohol and easily dump it into whatever you happen to be drinking at the time. These are actually, there's a lot of reproductions of these on eBay. I actually bought myself one of these. And the first time the bars opened up in New York City after COVID, I actually brought it out there and tried out, gave my little flask a trial run. But this was another very popular way to smuggle alcohol during Prohibition. So I like to call this one, my, what a big flask you have. But it was actually called the Bootlegger's Life Preserver. It was also a very popular way to smuggle alcohol, especially among women. Now, this kind of is hard to believe today, but back in Prohibition, it was actually illegal to search women in many states. You could not search a woman if you suspected her of smuggling alcohol. So women knew about this, they took full advantage of it, and therefore tried to hide alcohol in any available place on their person. They hid it in their garter belts, in their bloomers, and their brassieres, and their corsets, and of course, underneath their big fur coats, just like this. So women were always the more dependable smugglers. Now, these are called cow shoes. They were not used to transport any alcohol, but they were indispensable to bootleggers who brewed moonshine in forests or meadows. If you take a look at the heel, you can see that they're carved of wood and made to resemble hoops. And they literally covered bootleggers' tracks if he was being pursued on foot by a Prohibition agent. The Prohibition agent would be running through the meadow looking for a man's shoe prints, and of course see nothing but cow tracks because the bootlegger was wearing these. Really kind of a fantastic invention. I wish these would come back into style. I've not found any pairs of these, alas. Whatever bootlegger had been wearing this particular pair got caught because these are being modeled by a Prohibition agent circa 1924. Which brings me to Will and Brandt's other problem in enforcing Prohibition. It was very difficult to find honest Prohibition agents. First of all, the starting salary for a Prohibition agent was only about $1,200 a year, which in some cities in the country was barely enough to make a living. And they all knew that they could make much more money taking bribes from bootleggers like George Remus. Why bother enforcing Prohibition when you could just make money taking bribes from all the bootleggers? And the really funny thing was that you did not have to have any qualifications at all to become a Prohibition agent. One of my favorite stories was there was a man serving time upstate in a New York prison for armed robbery and murder when he got his Prohibition agent badge. So you could actually be a criminal and become a Prohibition agent. Will and Brandt was very aware of this problem and was always on the lookout for good, honest Prohibition agents. So, which brings me to Franklin Dodge. So if you've read the book, you know what a big part he plays in the book. Franklin Dodge is Will and Brandt's ace of detectives. He comes from a very prominent Michigan family. His family was active politicians, very wealthy, well-respected family. He got a job in the federal government very young and sort of worked his way upward. And Will and Brandt saw something in him. He was willing to go undercover to do kind of step over, straddle the line to get some information about bootleggers. He broke up a big syndicate for her in Savannah, and she decided that he was her best guy. And she called him her ace of detectives. So she decides to send Franklin Dodge to go after George Remus's bootlegging empire. Franklin Dodge is good enough at his job that he succeeds in getting Remus arrested, despite all of Remus's promises from the federal government. He goes to jail. He's in jail in the Atlanta penitentiary, which I'll talk about in a little bit more too. But then Wilton Brandt decides to send Franklin Dodge down to the Atlanta penitentiary to investigate corruption. There were a lot of very wealthy bootleggers in Atlanta penitentiary, and shady things were going on. So she sends Franklin Dodge down there to investigate. Now, by this time, George Remus had started hearing things about Franklin Dodge. He heard that Franklin Dodge was amenable to a quid pro quo. He was open to bribes. If the bootleggers approached him, he might be willing to work out some sort of underground deal with them. So Remus decides that Franklin Dodge is going to help him get out of prison. The next time Imogene Remus goes to visit her husband at the Atlanta penitentiary, he makes a request and says, Imogene, I want you to cultivate Franklin Dodge. Just make friends with him, cultivate him, and we'll get him to be on our side. So of course, Imogene Remus begins cultivating Franklin Dodge, but not quite in the way that George Remus had hoped. This was a recurring theme I ran into often during my research, the Flapper Menace. Apparently flappers were dangerous to the country's well-being and safety, especially middle-aged flappers. You know, these were women who were old enough to know better. Imogene Remus was 39 years old when George was in the Atlanta penitentiary, so she qualified as a middle-aged flapper. The New York Times defined a middle-aged flapper as she who does over the old house and builds a new one where her husband is deposited while she goes out in search of culture. So Franklin Dodge becomes Imogene Remus's culture. And to me, this was just sort of a backlash against where women were in society at this time period. You know, the 1920s were a period of great change for women. They had finally gotten the right to vote. Many people were unhappy with the fact that their wives, their sisters, their sweethearts, their mothers suddenly had the right to vote. And women were challenging social conventions and daring to act in ways that had been previously just reserved to the domain of men. And so there was a backlash, and the idea that flappers were dangerous and women stepping outside of those preconceived societal notions of what a woman was a dangerous idea. And so there was obviously going to be a furious backlash, not only against the older flappers, but the younger ones as well. And here is a flapper. There was a Flapper magazine. The younger generation of flappers started their own magazine, and they developed the quintessential definition of a flapper. And they said a flapper was somebody with a jitney body and a limousine mind, which I just think is a fantastic definition and should come back into vogue. And they had their own slang. Here is part of the Flapper dictionary. A barlow is a chicken. Apple knocker is a hay shaker. Some of these need their own definitions. A boob pickler was a girl who entertains father's out of town customers. A canceled stamp was a wallflower. So they had their own kind of lingo. The younger flappers were even portrayed as being sexual predators. This is one of my favorite cartoons. It's quite ridiculous. If you read the middle panel, it says, unsuspecting boys were forced to endure such unseemly exercises as cheek dancing. So even cheek dancing was considered a danger to young men all across the country. So this is J. Edgar Hoover, young baby J. Edgar Hoover. He was only 24 years old and he was only 29 years old when he became the director of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924. The Bureau of Investigation was the precursor to the FBI. And J. Edgar Hoover would not have gotten this job without Mabel Walker Wilton Brandt's recommendation. I kind of love that fact and the idea that he was being ordered around by this woman when he first started out his job. And we all know J. Edgar Hoover was involved in many shady and controversial elements throughout American history. But during this time period, early in his tenure, he was very sincere about wanting to have an honest force of prohibition agents. And he had started also hearing rumors about Franklin Dodge. He heard that Franklin Dodge was going around with Imogene Remus, stealing things from George Remus's mansion, stealing his whiskey certificates, doing all sorts of things that would not acceptable behavior for a federal prohibition agent. So J. Edgar Hoover decides to send his own man to investigate and follow and trail Franklin Dodge. So sort of a spy versus spy situation. And J. Edgar Hoover's man discovers that Franklin Dodge is doing all of those things, running around stealing whiskey certificates and cavorting with Imogene Remus, and actually catches Franklin Dodge literally with his pants down. And I just say that because it's very rare in nonfiction where you can write a scene where somebody is literally caught with their pants down. But in this book, I was able to do it. It was quite fun. Anyway, I think it says a lot about the characters in this book that J. Edgar Hoover here is actually one of the good guys. So here's George Remus in prison in Atlanta Penitentiary. Do not let his morose expression fool you. He was in a section of the jail known as Millionaire's Row, along with very other wealthy bootleggers. They were allowed to have their own maid. They had their own cook. They had elaborate dinner parties laid out on a long mahogany table with fresh linens and fresh flowers. Imogene Remus came and scrubbed her cell on her hands and knees. They had luxury. George Remus even had a stash of alcohol that he could offer to visiting reporters, which in the height of Prohibition, I mean, there's so much insanity just in that fact alone. But despite all of these luxuries, George Remus was miserable. And he was miserable because he had lost control. You know, you lose control in prison, no matter how luxurious your circumstances are. He was especially upset about losing control of Imogene. He also had started to hear rumors about Franklin Dodge and his wife, that they were running around together, that they had started having a torrid affair. And he was greatly disturbed by this. He got increasingly disturbed. If you read the book, you know how increasingly disturbed he got. And he did not know what to do. Being behind bars, he felt quite helpless. And every time Imogene Remus would come to visit him, he would say to her, you know, darling, are you cultivating Franklin Dodge? Am I any closer to getting out of prison? Is he going to help me? And she would just smile sweetly and say, don't worry, Daddy, Franklin Dodge is our friend. So this is Harry Truesdale. This is the professional hitman that Imogene Remus and Franklin Dodge hired to kill George Remus. And I think it says something about how outrageous the developments in this book are, that even the professional hitman, the hired killer, is so wary of George and Imogene Remus and decides that they're so crazy that he might be the one that ends up getting killed. And he wants to wash his hands of the whole thing. So even the professional hitman becomes scared of George and Imogene Remus. This is my final slide. This is George Remus's tombstone. He's buried in Falmouth, Kentucky. And as the story goes, somebody wrote a letter saying that George Remus, having lived the life that he lived, did not deserve to have angel wings on his tombstone. So the very next day, somebody goes out, takes a hammer and smashes the wings off of the tombstone. And this is how it appears today. And I like to finish by saying that, you know, people who write narrative nonfiction, people who do what I do, we often lament that we are beholden to the historical record. You know, we're not allowed to make up dialogue. We're not allowed to make up characters or events or anything. But the Ghost of Freedom Park, I was lucky because it represents the very first time that the dead people did exactly what I wanted them to do. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, for watching. Happy to take any questions. If you have any scandalous Prohibition stories from your own family, I'm happy to hear your stories. So take it away.
I think at this point, thank you so much, Abbott. That was just
thank you.
Such a good,
thank you.
Fulfilling filling out the book. I mean, having read it, it just made it all come back to life in a very succinct way. I'm going to welcome anyone to unmute themselves and ask a question, since they're you know, we're kind of a small group. So if you do, or you can raise your hand, or
Miss Karen Tartell.
Oh, hi, Karen.
Hi.
Hello.
I just want to say thank you so much. I love the book. And
thank you.
What my wish when I was reading the book was to be able to see pictures of these people. So I'm so grateful that today we got to see all those people's photographs. It really made the whole thing so much more fun. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you. And I could have a comment about that. You know, I have often historically, my other books included a lot of pictures. And in this one, I sort of took a note from The Great Gatsby. If you notice in that book, he doesn't really describe, J.J. Gatsby is never really described. He's very sparse in his descriptions. That was one influence for me. I really wanted to sort of try to capture that time period as much as possible. And the other is kind of a funny story. I have a very good author friend. I'm sure you all have read him, Eric Larson. He writes narrative nonfiction. He and I were once having a conversation about pictures in our books. And he said he does not like to use photographs in his books. He only uses one photograph to open each section. And I decided to do that in this book. But his reasoning was that, often if there's any kind of love interest or, a prominent character, they're sometimes the way that they're described historically is very florid language, the beauty and the sensation and how gorgeous they were and how lovely and how charming. And then you look at the actual pictures of these people, and this is his gesture, and they're like, they never quite live up to the descriptions of them or to what you're expecting them to look like. And because there was such a prominent love affair in this book with Imogene and Franklin Dodge, I did include a picture of Imogene because she was such a major player. I did not want to include a picture of Franklin Dodge. I thought it might, I expected him to look like Cary Grant or some sort of dashing old, silent film star. And he does not look like that. And I did not want to ruin the fantasy when anybody was reading. So I decided to include one picture of Remus, one picture of Mabel Walker Willenbrandt, and one picture of Imogene. And I figured that anything else, I could include in my slideshow. But that was it. It's usually just, you just like to let people's imagination sometimes have the final say.
I really like that a lot. Because I actually bought it and read it on my Kindle, and I thought when I saw these pictures, I thought, geez, I really missed out. I didn't go to the end of the Kindle and see all the pictures because I didn't realize they were there. So,
yeah. They were I'm surprised that they don't include them in Kindle. I
thought maybe I missed these, but now I know that they weren't in there. So
yes, they were definitely not in there. And I figured, if people really wanted to, they could get in touch with me, or they'd come to one of my talks and they would see the rest of it. So.
And that's a good way. I think that's a good plan. And I like the way you said that it lets people have their own imagination. And, these days when everything's thrown at us in images.
Yeah. It's just nice to, let the words speak for themselves and let people's imagination take over a little bit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other questions?
So I have a question. My name is Moira Craw. You probably all know me except for Abbott. And
hello.
Hi, how are you? I actually listened to the recorded book, which I thought was really well done.
Good.
I enjoyed it a lot. And I will be absolutely 100% honest with you. In the middle of the night, when I sometimes wake up and I can't go back to sleep again, I listen to my recorded books. And the terrible thing is that sometimes I doze off again. And so I listened to the book actually 2 times, and sort of the parts that I read toward the end kind of overlapped. And I just wanted to make sure that I realized that at the end, does Remus actually murder his wife? I mean, what I'm confused as to. There was I thought where he goes back to the mansion and she's completely messed up the house. Yeah. And then so I kind of have a gap in the story there.
Well, I would hate to. I don't know if everybody here has read it. I would hate to ruin it for anyone who hasn't read it. So I don't. If you've all read it, I'm happy to discuss. But that's why I stop my slideshow where I do, because I want people. I want to save some of the story for people. And if everybody's read it, you know what, Maura? Why don't you email me? I'm happy to finish it, or email me. I'm happy to chat with you privately about it all you want. So okay, yeah.
Well, now I'm really very intrigued. I listened. We read the first book together. What was it? In 2015. I loved that book about the Civil War. And I'm not going to try to remember the order of the title.
Yeah, I know. It's
like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Exactly. Liar, Tempter, Soldier, Spy.
So now I'm really interested in reading about the brothel And
Okay.
is that called Sin in the City or Sin and the City?
Sin in the Second City.
In the Second City. Thank you, because
Sin in the
that's going to
Second
be my
City,
next
yeah.
read. No, I love
thank
your
you.
work. Thank you. It's
Thank you very
wonderful.
much.
I'm really honored
I'd love to
make your
connect with you on
acquaintance.
email. Yeah, likewise. And I'd love to, let's stay in touch. Email me and I'll make sure you have any other questions answered. So
Great. Thank you. This is
Yeah.
really fascinating.
good. I'm glad.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, this is fun. I like a small focused group who's really into it. So
That's good.
Excellent.
So if there are no other questions, I don't know, does anyone else have a question? I think we don't want to monopolize Abbott's time too much, but
if something occurs to you, please feel free to email me. I'm always interested to chat with readers.
That's great.
So feel free.
I
Yeah.
can share your email with anyone who's interested. And thank you so much. We can't wait to see what you're working on now. And
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy my next one. It's more debauched characters that I think I'm having a lot of fun with the research. And I just want to say, if anybody is on Amazon or Goodreads, if you have a few minutes to leave 5 stars and a few kind words, it really the word of mouth is really helpful. So anyway, but yes, let's do it again for the next one. Or if you wanted me to join me with Sin in the Second City, I'm happy to do that too, or whatever you guys want to do.
oh, that sounds like a great idea.
That sounds like fun. I'm
yeah.
up for it.
All right. Well, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
I'm glad we could do this today.
Yep. Us
Thank
too.
you. Thank you.
Everyone
Thank
for
you.
joining us.